He didn't move, not when he was accused, not when the king's voice rose, and not even when the monarch of the United Kingdom stepped forward and punched him across the face. But what no one expected, what silenced the entire hall, was who spoke next. Not a general, not a minister, not even a royal advisor. It was the little Princess Charlotte, and her tears changed everything. Now, before we reveal exactly what the princess said in that moment, make sure you're subscribed to our channel Guard Watch and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear isn't just emotional, it's historic. The banners fluttered stiffly in the late afternoon breeze, their embroidered crests catching slants of golden sun as Windsor's parade ground filled with the precision of military ceremony. Rows of decorated British and French officials stood shoulder to shoulder on freshly raked gravel, while bleachers held diplomats and international journalists behind velvet ropes and uniformed stewards. Now, before we show you exactly what Princess Charlotte did when her father lost control, make sure you're subscribed to our channel Guard Watch and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness didn't just change one man's day, it changed how the world saw the monarchy forever. Beneath the white marquee, King Charles III sat with rigid perfection, his ceremonial uniform catching the light. To his right, Queen Camilla whispered to a Ministry of Defence official. 2 seats down, Princess Charlotte fidgeted with her ribbon, small legs swinging above the platform. Standing 20 paces away, Sergeant Thomas Renner of the Coldstream Guards embodied everything the ceremony represented. At 38, 3 tours in Helmand Province had carved lines around his eyes that no parade drilling could erase. His scarlet tunic was textbook perfect, his bearing immaculate, except for his boots, not exactly scuffed, but not mirror-bright either. Earlier that morning, he'd broken up a fight between 2 recruits, preventing injury but scuffing his toe on a fallen scabbard. When offered fresh boots, he'd simply shaken his head. We're here to represent discipline, not look pretty for cameras. What Renner didn't know was that King Charles was in one of his moods, the kind triggered by optics rather than substance. A uniform thread out of place. Casual language in front of foreign dignitaries, a guardsman whose boots weren't parade perfect. So as the first notes of God Save the King echoed across the parade ground, Renner stood tall beneath the flags of 2 nations, disciplined, dignified, and completely unaware that his boots were about to become the least of his problems. As God Save the King echoed across the parade ground, Renner noticed the young French guardsman 2 feet to his left wavering. The soldier's right leg trembled, not from nerves, but muscle fatigue from locking his knee too hard. His balance was failing. Renner moved without thinking, his right hand extended barely an inch to grip the young man's elbow, firm enough to provide support, gentle enough to avoid attention. 3 seconds. The French soldier steadied. The anthem continued. No civilian noticed. No camera caught it. But King Charles saw everything from his elevated position. His trained eye caught the moment of contact, a breach of ceremonial bearing during the national anthem. He couldn't see the context, the trembling leg, the prevented collapse. All Charles saw was a red-coated arm moving when it should have been still. The image burned in his mind, discipline failing under pressure, standards slipping when they mattered most. Beside him, Camilla noticed the subtle tightening around her husband's eyes. She followed his gaze across the formation, trying to identify what had triggered that particular expression, the one that usually preceded someone having a very bad day. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. Charles didn't answer directly, but his slight nod toward the back of the reviewing stand was clear enough. A Ministry of Defence official leaned forward as if receiving telepathic instructions, his face shifting into the carefully neutral expression that military personnel use when they're about to deliver unwelcome news to someone who won't want to hear it. To most observers, the gesture meant nothing, just another piece of the administrative machinery that keeps state functions running smoothly. But anyone who understood military hierarchy recognized the subtle transmission of authority, the way orders form and travel through invisible channels. Renner remained motionless, his breathing returned to parade rhythm, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. The French soldier beside him had recovered completely, his grateful glance lasting only a fraction of a second before discipline reasserted itself. The incident was over, forgotten by everyone except the one person whose opinion would determine what happened next. The anthem concluded with a flourish that seemed to lift the entire ceremony towards some higher purpose. Applause rippled through the bleachers as the band transitioned smoothly into the French national anthem, flags dipped in unison, and another perfect moment unfolded according to its carefully rehearsed script. But beneath the surface choreography, something had shifted. Charles's fingers drummed once against the armrest of his chair, a sound swallowed by the music but visible to anyone watching closely enough. The judgment had been made, the decision rendered, the machinery of consequence already grinding into motion. What followed would have nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with perception. And in that gap between what had actually happened and what appeared to have happened, a good man's reputation was about to be sacrificed to a bad king's mood. The ceremony ended in textbook fashion, but Renner felt the shift immediately. MOD officials scanned him with cold glances. Whispers followed him. A young staffer approached with obvious nerves. "Sergeant Renner, His Majesty was displeased with your bearing during the ceremony. You're to remain stationed inside after the procession." No explanation, no context. Just the order. Renner was positioned directly behind the royal chairs in the reception hall, close enough to hear everything, isolated from any comfort. The placement sent its message clearly. Princess Charlotte, settling into her seat, leaned sideways to peek at him. "That's the one who helped the boy," she whispered to Camilla. "Quiet now," Camilla replied firmly. "Eyes forward." But Charlotte kept watching with 8-year-old perception that cuts through adult pretense. The reception settled into diplomatic rhythm, crystal against china, orchestral music, careful conversation. Then Charles moved suddenly, tapping his microphone. The feedback silenced the room instantly. "Coldstream Sergeant Renner." Every head turned. Conversations died. Cameras clicked. "Approach," Charles commanded coldly. Renner stepped forward, standing at attention beside the royal table. This man broke ceremonial bearing during our national anthem, in front of foreign dignitaries, in front of the crown. Renner's lips parted to explain, but Charles cut him off sharply. "Do not bother to explain. We do not move unless commanded. You know this." "You are not a symbol if you cannot uphold it," Charles said, his voice stripped of diplomatic courtesy. "Your Majesty, I assisted a soldier who nearly lost his balance." "You moved," Charles interrupted with blade-like precision. "You acted without orders. That's not duty. That's vanity." Then Charles stood, took one step forward and struck. Not a slap, a closed fist punch, delivered with royal authority, catching Renner squarely across the jaw. The sound cracked across marble like a gunshot. Renner's head jerked with impact, but he straightened immediately, resuming perfect posture as if the blow had never landed. No hand touched his face. No sound escaped. His dignity remained unbroken. "No!" Princess Charlotte's voice cut through the chaos. She pushed her chair back hard and burst into tears. "He was helping," she cried. "You didn't even ask. You hit him." Then she walked across the marble floor toward Renner with determined steps that echoed through breathless silence. Charlotte stopped directly in front of Renner, close enough to see the bruise blooming across his jaw. "He helped someone so they wouldn't fall. I saw it," she said, her voice carrying with absolute certainty. She looked up at her father. "Why did you hit him?" Raw, unfiltered truth from someone too young for political calculations. Camilla started to interrupt. "Charlotte." "No," the girl said firmly, turning back to Renner. "You didn't do anything wrong. You weren't even moving, just helping." Tears threatened, but she held steady. "And he hit you." Renner responded gently. "Your Highness, it's all right." Charlotte shook her head with vehemence. "No, it's not." The hall held its breath as everyone grappled with a child correcting adults who had forgotten basic decency. King Charles stood frozen, watching his daughter defend the man he'd just assaulted, realizing she possessed more dignity than he'd shown. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences that had come before, not empty or expectant, but full of judgment rendered and found wanting. Charlotte's questions hung in the air like accusations that demanded answers no one was prepared to give. The weight of that silence finally reached King Charles, penetrating whatever fog of pride and frustration had driven him to this moment of public disgrace. Standing there on the royal dais, surrounded by the symbols of his authority and the witnesses to his failure, he found himself looking not at a room full of subjects, but at his daughter, 8 years old, tear-stained, and absolutely certain that justice mattered more than convenience. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, holding the kind of moral clarity that adults spend their lives trying to recover after the world teaches them to compromise their principles for political necessity. She wasn't asking for explanations or excuses or diplomatic language that would soften the edges of what everyone had witnessed. She was asking her father to be worthy of the crown he wore. Charles felt the full weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, not the ceremonial weight of robes and medals and centuries of tradition, but the personal weight of a man who had allowed his worst instincts to triumph over everything he'd been taught about leadership and responsibility and the difference between authority and power. His eyes moved from Charlotte to Renner, taking in for the first time not just the scarlet uniform but the man wearing it, the weathered features that spoke of service in places where protocol meant staying alive rather than standing pretty. The perfect military bearing maintained even after public assault, the dignity that no violence could diminish or destroy. "You did not break bearing," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying a different quality now, not the sharp edge of royal authority, but something softer, more uncertain, more human. A few heads turned. Conversations that had been whispered behind hands fell silent. Even the French delegation straightened, recognizing the sound of a man beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Charles stepped down from the dais, moving slowly as if the weight of realization was making every gesture more deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of careful precision that comes when someone realizes their next words will define not just the moment but their character. "You assisted another soldier," he continued, each word chosen with the awareness that they would be quoted in history books and constitutional law courses and military academies for generations to come. "And for that, you were punished." Renner nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged both the accuracy of the statement and the courage it had taken to make it. "Sir," he said, the single word carrying more dignity than entire speeches about honour and duty. Charles winced visibly, as if the simple acknowledgement was more painful than any elaborate condemnation could have been. He looked again at his daughter, still standing protectively in front of the man he'd struck, her presence a living reminder of the principles he'd abandoned in favour of injured pride. "And I?" he began, then stopped. Even Camilla was watching now, her diplomatic composure replaced by something more personal as she witnessed her husband grapple with the gap between who he was supposed to be and who he'd revealed himself to be. "I reacted," Charles finished, the words emerging with visible difficulty. "Not as king, not as commander, but as a man, one who was afraid of losing control over perception. And so I lost control over something more important." He turned toward Charlotte, his expression holding the kind of vulnerability that comes when adults realize they've disappointed the children who believed in them. "You weren't being a king just now," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the tears that still glistened on her cheeks. "You were being mean." The words weren't sharp or accusatory. They carried the simple honesty that children use when describing what they see, without the filters that adults employ to make reality more comfortable. But their impact was devastating, precisely because of that simplicity, that refusal to dress up the truth in diplomatic language or royal protocol. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably as they processed the implications of what they were witnessing: a child correcting a king, a princess teaching the crown about dignity, an 8-year-old girl demonstrating more leadership in a moment of crisis than the entire royal institution had managed in decades. Camilla looked away, unable to witness her husband's destruction of his own authority in front of an international audience. Military officers stared at their plates, recognizing the sound of discipline collapsing under the weight of poor judgment and unchecked emotion. But Renner looked directly at Charles for the first time since the confrontation began, his expression holding not anger or resentment, but something more complex, the recognition that passes between people who have both made mistakes and the acknowledgement that courage sometimes comes in forms we don't expect. King Charles found himself stripped of everything except the choice between continuing to defend the indefensible or finding whatever remained of the principles that had once justified his position at the apex of British society. Standing there between a guardsman and a little girl, he discovered that they were both braver than he had been, and that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is simply admitting when you've failed to lead. The admission hung in the air like something fragile and unprecedented, the sound of royal authority acknowledging its own limitations in front of witnesses who would carry the story to every corner of the Commonwealth. King Charles stood before his daughter and the man he'd struck, no longer protected by ceremony or protocol, or the careful language that usually insulated royalty from the consequences of their actions. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when shedding armour that has become too heavy to carry. When he raised his eyes to look at the press gallery, where cameras continued recording every moment of this unscripted collapse of royal composure, his voice carried a different weight entirely. "Strike this from the official record," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at the reporters, whose lenses had captured every moment of his disgrace. He paused, and in that silence you could hear the recalibration of an institution in real time. "No," he said, shaking his head with the finality of someone making a choice they know they can't take back. "Do not strike this. Let it stand." The murmur that rippled through the assembled dignitaries carried the sound of people witnessing history being made by accident, the moment when carefully managed royal image met unmanaged human reality and lost decisively. Charles turned back towards Sergeant Renner, still standing at attention despite everything that had happened, still maintaining the kind of dignity that no assault could diminish. The king raised his hand to his temple, then slowly, deliberately moved it to his chest. A salute. It was crisp, measured, and absolutely personal, not the ceremonial gesture of a monarch acknowledging a subject, but the recognition of one soldier by another, the acknowledgement of character that transcends rank or title, or the artificial hierarchies that separate people from their essential humanity. The room inhaled as one, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the long history of British monarchy. "I acted rashly," Charles said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, "and without just cause. In a moment of pride, I forgot the values I was crowned to represent. I forgot that honour is not maintained by punishment, but by humility." He looked at the bruise spreading across Renner's jaw, then at the child who had walked between them when the adults in the room had chosen silence over justice. "You, Sergeant, upheld those values. Even under disgrace, even under assault, you did what was right and bore what was wrong." Renner's posture remained perfect, but something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a breath caught somewhere between discipline and gratitude. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady, carrying the kind of truth that only comes from experience earned in places where character matters more than convenience. "I served under men who made mistakes," he said, meeting Charles's eyes directly for the first time since the ceremony began. "The best ones admitted them, sir." It wasn't a rebuke or an accusation. It was a lifeline thrown across the gap between what had happened and what could still be salvaged from the wreckage of the day. The kind of grace that combat veterans understand, because they've learned that survival sometimes depends on forgiveness, that moving forward matters more than settling scores. Charlotte stepped forward again, her small hands reaching out to grip Renner's sleeve with the possessive care of someone claiming ownership over what's right in a world that often seems determined to choose what's wrong. The hall watched in silence as she looked back at her father, her voice carrying across the marble with the kind of clarity that cuts through years of accumulated wisdom and political calculation. "He didn't need a punishment," she said, her words breaking slightly but holding firm through the emotion. "He needed someone to say sorry. The simple truth of it, hit like a physical blow. Around the room, diplomats and ministers and military officers found themselves confronted with the testimony of someone too young to understand that sometimes saying sorry is the hardest thing powerful people ever have to do. Camilla closed her eyes briefly, recognizing in her stepdaughter's words the kind of moral authority that her husband had just surrendered in favor of wounded pride and poor judgment. Charles nodded once, the gesture acknowledging not just his daughter's wisdom, but the courage it had taken to offer it in front of people whose approval had seemed more important than doing what was right. He stepped forward and placed his hand gently on Renner's shoulder. Not the gesture of a king acknowledging a subject, but the touch of one human being offering peace to another after causing unnecessary pain. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried the weight of genuine remorse rather than political calculation. "For the assault, for the injustice, for failing to see what my daughter saw clearly from the beginning." Renner, for the first time since the ceremony began, broke bearing in the smallest possible way, just enough to meet the king's eyes directly, just enough to offer the kind of forgiveness that doesn't erase what happened but makes it possible to move forward. "Apology accepted, Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady with the kind of dignity that no ceremony could teach and no violence could destroy. And in that moment, with cameras recording every word for posterity and witnesses who would carry the story to every corner of the world, the monarchy remembered what it was supposed to represent. Not the perfection of power, but the humanity that makes power worth having in the first place. The clink of silverware resumed gradually, tentatively, as if the normal rhythms of civilized gathering were being tested to see if they still worked after witnessing the near collapse and unexpected redemption of an ancient institution. Conversations began again in hushed tones, diplomats leaning toward each other with the kind of carefully modulated urgency that suggested tomorrow's cables to foreign ministries were already being mentally composed. King Charles, no longer standing behind the imposing barrier of the royal table, but seated once more with his gloves removed and his expression softer than it had been all day, gestured for Sergeant Renner to approach again. But this time, the summons carried none of the sharp authority that had preceded the confrontation. "Please," he said, and the word held the weight of invitation rather than command. "Sit." The reaction was immediate and audible, a collective intake of breath from people who understood they were witnessing something that had never happened before in the long history of British royal protocol. Royal guards didn't sit at state banquets. They didn't join conversations with kings and queens. They maintained their posts and their silence and their invisible presence while history unfolded around them. But Renner, after a moment's pause that acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the gesture, nodded once and stepped forward. He sat at the edge of the table with his back still straight and his hands folded in his lap, his scuffed boots touching the carpet that had been positioned to showcase the furniture of power rather than the humanity of the people who served it. Across the table, Ministry of Defence officials whispered in hurried conferences, their expressions reflecting the kind of bureaucratic panic that comes when established procedures collide with unscripted reality. Camilla noticed their discomfort and addressed it with the kind of sharp efficiency that reminded everyone why she'd survived decades in the complex ecology of royal politics. "Let the king correct his own error," she said, her voice carrying enough steel to cut through whatever objections they might have been preparing. Beside Charles, Princess Charlotte climbed back onto her seat and settled herself with the solemn grace of someone who understood that important moments required careful attention. She scooted slightly closer to Renner, studying him with the kind of focused interest that children reserve for people they've decided are worth defending. The French ambassador leaned toward his British counterpart, his voice low but carrying in the acoustic perfection of the hall. "That," he murmured with the kind of diplomatic understatement that masked deeper currents of analysis, was handled with considerable courage. The British minister nodded, recognizing in the Frenchman's careful phrasing both approval and the suggestion that today's events would be remembered as something more significant than a simple breach of protocol. As dessert was served and the orchestra resumed playing soft instrumental pieces that seemed designed to restore the atmosphere of civilized gathering, the final hour of the ceremony continued according to its scripted progression. But everyone present understood that the real substance of the day had already been determined in those moments when a king chose accountability over authority, and a child's tears proved more powerful than centuries of accumulated tradition. The conversations that would follow, in embassy cars and government offices, in newspaper editorial meetings and military clubs throughout the Commonwealth, would focus not on trade agreements or cultural exchanges, but on the afternoon when royal dignity collapsed and was rebuilt by an 8-year-old girl who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. Charles cleared his throat one final time, not to command attention, but to offer a conclusion that would help people make sense of what they'd witnessed. "In our military," he said, his voice carrying clearly but without the sharp edge that had characterized his earlier words, "we teach soldiers to endure. In our family, we should learn to listen. Today, one guardsman did both." The line would be quoted in newspapers and analysed by constitutional scholars and remembered by veterans who understood the difference between bearing punishment and bearing witness to truth. But more importantly, it was heard by the man whose character had been tested in front of the world and found stronger than the institution that had tried to break it. The final toast came and went with the mechanical precision of diplomatic protocol, crystal glasses raised in acknowledgement of friendships between nations and cooperation between peoples who shared more similarities than differences. But the emotional centre of the ceremony had already passed, leaving everyone present with the understanding that they'd witnessed something far more complex than a simple state dinner. They'd witnessed a reckoning. As the royal entourage prepared to depart, King Charles lingered near the centre of the hall, speaking quietly with Ministry of Defence officials whose expressions suggested they were still trying to calculate the long-term implications of what had happened. He gestured once towards Sergeant Renner, who had returned to his position at the edge of the gathering, but remained somehow more visible than he'd been when the day began. An aide approached the guardsman carrying a small velvet box, his manner suggesting the kind of careful formality that surrounds moments when institutions attempt to restore their dignity through symbolic gestures. "His Majesty requests that you accept this," the aide said, opening the box to reveal a medal that caught the light from the chandeliers. "For gallantry under restraint. Personal issue." Renner looked down at the decoration, then back at the aide. "Tell him thank you," he said quietly. "But don't tarnish it with guilt. Let me finish the parade first." Before the aide could respond, with whatever diplomatic language might smooth over such an unexpected response, another voice intervened. "It's not guilt." Charles had approached without ceremony, his expression calmer and more focused than it had been since the ceremony began. "It's respect," he continued, holding out the box again with hands that no longer trembled with suppressed emotion. "Not from a throne, from a man." This time, Renner accepted the box without hesitation, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift is allowing someone else the opportunity to do better than they've done before. Before anyone could speak, or the moment could be formalized into another piece of royal protocol, Princess Charlotte appeared at Renner's side, with the kind of sudden materialization that seems to be a particular talent of 8-year-olds. Her small fingers reached into the box, extracted the medal, and, standing on her toes to reach, pinned it somewhat crookedly to the front of his uniform. "It's not straight," she whispered, frowning at her handiwork with the kind of concentration that suggested the angle of the decoration was a matter of considerable importance. "It's perfect," Renner replied, and his voice carried the kind of warmth that comes when someone recognizes that the value of a gesture has nothing to do with its technical execution. Charlotte stepped back to admire her work, then did something that no one in the room had anticipated. Something that would be remembered long after the details of diplomatic conversation and ceremonial procedure had faded from memory. She saluted him, not the playful, approximate gesture that children usually offer when they're mimicking adult behavior, but a real salute. Formal, deliberate, held for exactly the right amount of time before being lowered with careful precision. The hall fell into the kind of silence that follows moments of unexpected grace, when ordinary people find themselves elevated beyond their usual limitations by circumstances that demand their best rather than their most convenient responses. "Thank you," Charlotte said, her voice carrying with the clarity that seems to be reserved for moments when truth needs to travel further than usual, "for protecting people." She paused, considering her words with the kind of careful attention that adults often forget to give their most important statements, "and for protecting me from anger." The observation hit like a revelation, the recognition that what they'd all witnessed wasn't just about military discipline or royal protocol or the proper relationship between authority and justice. It was about what happens when children are forced to watch adults choose pride over principle, and how sometimes the greatest act of protection is simply refusing to let injustice stand unchallenged. Every photographer in the room raised their camera simultaneously, understanding that they were recording the moment when a princess taught the world something about courage, and an old soldier learned that sometimes the people we serve are worth more than the institutions that employ us. By the time the royal family completed their departure, the story was already spreading through the networks that connect military bases and government offices and newspaper editorial rooms across 2 continents. The images would appear on front pages by morning, but the meaning would take longer to fully understand. Sergeant Thomas Renner stood where he'd always stood, boots planted firmly, shoulders squared, eyes alert to whatever duties remained. But he was no longer just part of the background, no longer simply a symbol of tradition and discipline and the reliable presence of military bearing in civilian settings. He had become something more important, proof that institutions are only as strong as the individuals who choose to serve them with honour. Even when that service comes at personal cost, even when doing what's right requires more courage than doing what's expected. And sometimes when those individuals are tested by the very power they've sworn to protect, the most important victories are won not through resistance or defiance, but through the quiet strength to endure whatever comes while maintaining the dignity that no assault can take away. The ceremony was over, the guard was maintained, and somewhere in the gap between what had almost been lost and what had ultimately been preserved, the monarchy remembered why it existed in the first place. Not to exercise power over people, but to serve principles that are larger than the individuals who happen to wear the crown. What do you think? Did King Charles go too far when he struck that guardsman, or was his public apology enough to restore the balance? And should we praise Princess Charlotte for her courage, or worry about an 8-year-old being put in a position where she had to correct the adults who were supposed to be setting the example? If this story reminded you that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Tap the bell icon because we post stories like this every single day, and you won't want to miss the moments when ordinary people do extraordinary things. Share this with someone who believes that doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy, because as we saw today, sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting when you're wrong. There's another story waiting for you right on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that character isn't about the uniform you wear or the title you carry, but about what you choose to do when everything falls apart and the only thing left is who you really are underneath it all.